Hey everyone, my name is Francisco Escobar and I'm the host and creator of this show, Conversamos. As we continue our It All Starts at Home edition, today's video is going to be on growing up and raising queer Latine and Latinxes. All here as Latin Entertainment presents Conversamos.
Is it that wrong? I'm making a song, I'm taking it back for the platform that I formed. You should help me transform. I run the reservoir, the predator, like a hungry carnivore. When I'm breaking through these heavy doors, this is Desert Storm. A metaphor to show I'm equipped and informed. I'm striking with the mega force.
We have an expert panel ready to discuss their experiences growing up and raising as a queer Latina or Latinx person. But first, we'd like to share our Latina business spotlight. Reclaiming Your Happiness with Lemus, LLC. With a coaching service, podcast, and a platform to highlight scholars of color, it is a great business to support, to build community, and a better tomorrow. Come check it out. Also, check out this episode's fundraising initiative. EspicyNipples, an inclusive transfeminist digital content cooperative based in Puerto Rico, and Sombrilla Cuir, a collective that creates educational content online among folks from our communities, are fundraising for their Bakeo para sobrevivir. Their initiative is to support those most in need on the island. Check them out on Instagram, YouTube, and Twitter. Donate today. Now, let me introduce you to our panel. We have Sergio Gonzalez and Dr. Anita Tijerina. Thank you two for joining us. And now with our first question, how would you describe your experience growing up as a queer Latina or Latinx? And if you're a parent, additionally share how that affected you raising your children.
I feel like for me, it's really been encompassing of like coming into like my joteria and like my truth, right? So like having to navigate this toxic masculinity and like a lot of Mexican machismo and just like cultural standards and norms. I guess kind of like an outlier, right? Because I feel like I grew into the confidence of who I am, how I perceive myself and what I want to do, right? Like in terms of like finding a purpose or what have you. And so then it finally like, I feel like that really created this being that is Sergio, that is very queer, that is very much so like loving, caring, compassionate, very passionate of like what he does, how he does it, and like what he's about. So.
I think my experience has been positive. As I mentioned, I think I walk a road of like that is intentionally built around surrounding myself with feminist people and queer allies. So like, I think I came into a racial consciousness early on. My mom has always been a strong woman and later, identified, once I told her what a feminist is, self-identified as a feminist. She's always, gave me a lot of strength and autonomy as a woman. So it didn't stop when it came around to queerness, right? I was a hetero-identified person up until my mid-20s, probably. And even if I can recollect early experiences of like queer desire, it wasn't until like my mid-20s that I said to my mom, Mom, I think I might be, at the time I was using a bisexual identity because again, I was acknowledging that there was attraction to both men and women, but now I identify as fluid because my sexual identity is very open and expansive, so I'm very pansexual and fluid. But at the time, I said to my mom, I think I might be bi, and I've written about this she said to me, well, that's good, mija. She said, I think I might be too. I might be bi too. She said, I think I just married your dad because I was expected to. And I talk about that moment as like this moment of liberation, right? And my mom has always been a source of liberation for me. She gave me permission to be an hocicona, to be a rebellious person, to, go across the world, across the country, even though we grew up really poor, no access to education. She was like, you go. I don't understand what you're doing, but you go and you do it. And then when it came to my queerness, same thing, right? So I've faced maybe a few hard conversations with like family that maybe, like aren't queer conscious and maybe have questions because of religion. And still, like, we're still able to have a really strong conversation about it. So I'd say my experience has been positive, has been supported, and in a lot of ways it's been kind of a bubble that I know a lot of people don't have. So I'm privileged to have that experience. I'm also, a feminist teacher, and it's not cool to hate on queer people in feminist community and or in Chicana Latinx academic community. So I'm lucky that I'm not experiencing any homophobia in those spaces either.
Thank you so much for sharing. And Sergio, from hearing that, is there any relation that you can share amongst your experience?
Oh yeah. So I think for me, right, I came out at 19. And so I ended up doing kind of what Doctora Anita was talking about. I left to school across the country, right? So I was born and bred in the Bay Area to Mexican parents. My dad's from Mexico. My mom is first generation Mexican American. So I never really identified as Chicano per se, right? Like it was like I'm Mexican and I'm from the Bay Area. Like it's always been how like I see it. No shade to Chicanos and Chicanexes, like, support you, love you, and I'm just like I never used that term because I never felt like it applied to me and like my existence and how I came to be in this space. But leaving a college was like a fresh start, and so I think it was in college when I was like, okay, like I'm gonna meet a bunch of new people. My best friend is here because we both ended up going to the same undergrad, right? Mm-hmm. And so this is the time to either like reinvent myself or like be, speak more of my truth. And so that's when I started saying, oh, I think I'm bisexual. And then it was like after the first semester, it was like, no, I'm gay. And that's that. So I'm a joto and that's it. There's no like going back. Yeah. And so I definitely had the privilege of having a very supportive grandparent system. I don't know how to like explain it. So my dad was obviously not about it. Very machista, very ignorant, pueblero from Jalisco, where like this is what the world looks like. This is what it is. And I was very strong in I'm letting you know because I don't want, no quiero que te diga la gente, prefiero que lo sepas de aquí, de mí, como hombres, and throwing that back at him. And he had a lot of trouble with it, but his parents in Mexico, from this little town in Los Altos de Jalisco, were very much like, if you have a problem with Sergio being queer, being a joto, what have you, then just don't show up when he's here because this is his house before yours. So it was a very like, what? Like, are you like what? And my grandma, my cookies, that's what I call her. She already passed away, but like she was the one that was like, this is what it is at my house. So either you're about it, get on the train, or just don't show up when he's here because this is his home over your house. And that was it.
Thank you. I want to acknowledge like that my aunt, who interestingly I was named after her. Her name is Anita. And she's like the youngest. She's the baby of my mom's family. She came out as a lesbian her senior year in high school. And she's maybe only 6 years older because my grandma had a lot of kids and she kept having them. So my aunt was pretty close to me in age. And I think she almost was like kind of like the trailblazer, right? Like she experienced a lot of the homophobia that my grandparents, had. In fact, she was asked to leave my grandmother's house, and I remember my mom was the one who accepted her, right? My mom was like, you know, come, sister. At the time, my mom wasn't identifying in any way queer. She was just like, that's not cool. This is my daughter, you know, I mean, my sister, and I'm not gonna, you know, break this relationship. And my grandmother now lives with my aunt and her wife. So there's been a full circle, right? And I think I just want to acknowledge that it's a lot of work. And one of the things that I've seen is that people say, like, Latinx people or African American people, that we have the most homophobic communities, but I don't believe that to be true. I believe all communities have their own form of homophobia. That's first. And then I also believe that our commitment to family is very deep, especially amongst working class Latinx people. Like, my grandma, she couldn't let go of her daughter, even if she was being homophobic. She was like, I want my daughter. And when she kept asking my mom and her other sisters or her other daughters, how's Mija doing? They were like, if you want to know, call her. And so she had to reestablish her relationship with her. So it's been at least a generation before me. That's why I didn't have to deal with anything, you know, because my mom was already on board, and my grandma already had to reckon with her homophobia early on.
So going on with our next question, how has navigating your queerness in the Latinx community or Chicanx community as well?
It was like navigating it at home, right? Trying to fit these social constructs, these heteronormative social constructs. So like having a girlfriend, doing all of that stuff, right? I call that the experimental phase in high school. So like going through that process, right? And not being true to myself, but being different, adaptable forms of myself, depending on the space that I was in, right? So like at home being a certain way, whereas with my friends, as I'm coming into my own, being another way. And I think it was once I came out, once I told my mom and my dad, and my parents are divorced. So once I told one and I told the other, I was like, I don't care. Like, I told the main two people that I need to know. So if anybody else knows, that's like not my problem. I'm not going to deal with it. And I think it was after I came out at 19, that's when I was like 100% myself, right? Like I was very much so, this is me, all of it. Take it or leave it. If you don't, that's fine. I don't need new friends kind of attitude. And so I think it was that huge, there was a huge difference in like, can I be myself? Am I afraid to be myself? And what are the repercussions, right? But once I came out, it was like, I don't know anybody else anything. I owe my parents, you know, because it goes back to what Dr. Anita brought up, right? The whole like that family connection and like that loyalty and like commitment to family is deep. It's like, it's something that I always think about and contemplate when I'm trying to take care of like my needs over the needs of my family, because we think as a unit, we grow as a unit, we flourish as a unit, having to figure out when is it about me and my sanity and my development, and when is it about a collective development and taking care of like la tia, or like supporting my dad, or supporting my mom, etc.
I think for me, I got lucky that I didn't realize I was queer till I was in my 20s, because I was already fully independent. I didn't come out until probably grad school, right? And it wasn't that I was hiding it, because I was fine, as an alleged hetero. But I think one of the reasons that I have had an easier experience is that I was already a fully autonomous adult. And I was respected because I was in higher ed. I was, a grad student getting a PhD, a future professor. And I was in feminist and queer community. Right? Like, in fact, it was my queer friends that helped me realize that I was queer, right? And I think that's so powerful. It's a different story, obviously. But I joined an organization that I later wrote about. It's I did my dissertation on it. It's a group called Lassa Women of UCLA. They no longer exist, but they were there from 1979 to like the early 2000s. And I wrote like a 6-year, study about them. And basically it was in that space. I had already come out to my mom, but it was in that space that I was like, this is the experience I want to live. I want to live a queer life and queer experience, not just identify as queer, right? I want to be a queer advocate, a queer activist. Like I want a joteria identity, right? And so it was really empowering to be amongst what we call mujeristas, right? We call ourselves mujeristas, Chicana Latina activists, who were like pushing people to question their identities, right? To be like, hey, if you're straight, why? Are you just straight by de facto? Or have you ever actually asked yourself what your true desire is, right? And I remember one of our, what we call veteranas, her name is Gardenia, and she was a badass, activist, organizer. And one time we were talking about sex, and the women were talking about sex with men. And she said, you know what's really beautiful? I always remember this. It's one of those little, little student meetings that you have in behind closed doors, right? And she says, you know what's really beautiful? Women making love to women. And it was just like the hetero women in the room were like, yeek, and it just makes you think like, oh, like, let me think about how beautiful that can be. Let me think about how I've been centering heteronormativity in my conversation about heterosexual sex. And that's what she did. She didn't shame us. She didn't, say, why y'all talking about sex with men? Like, I want this space to be open to queer people. But she was very clear that she wanted space that could honor her life. And I think because of her presence, it really said to me, I want to know what that experience is like, to have space that is queer and queer identified, and to be able to question my own sexuality and create space for other people to question their sexuality. And so I always say that I practice a Lassa woman mujerista pedagogy. Like, what they taught me, I teach in my classroom. So I guarantee you there have been at least 100 alleged straight people in my classrooms that come out as queer because they've been given the permission to question their straight sexuality. So when you ask my experience in community, and I have been nourished and I have been pushed to another level of identity and self-reflection that has been really, transformative for me.
For our next question, what messages have you learned from your mother and or father growing up? Also, what messages are you teaching to your child or children?
So for me, I grew up with a very powerful matriarchy, right? My parents divorced when I was like, I think around 2, 3, maybe 4. No, 3. And I grew up with a single mom. So my mom would have relationships and then would not. But for the most part, a single mom. And because of that, my mom's a Scorpio. So mom's very, very powerful, very like, this is how this goes. If you like my way or the highway kind of attitude, strict Mexican mom. And I think that was very powerful. And I didn't realize the power in that, right? And the autonomy in that. My mom managed to raise all 4 of us as a single mom, did her thing, worked when she had to work. Then there were times where she didn't work, but she managed to have a roof over our head, managed to advocate for us when she needed to, right? And so I saw that a lot with the way she advocated for my sister in primary education. And I think that was that motivating factor that like made me hocicón, made me become like my own self-advocate with my education. So as I'm learning about, I keep being placed in like remedial courses when I should be taking these courses to be college eligible, which happened my freshman year. It was the influence that I got from my mom at home, being very like vocal, expressive about like, this is how things are. If someone does something, you need to like, let me know, that I started, advocating for myself, and like little by little, really understanding the power of being like a mujer, like, and the matriarchy, and how the matriarchy really holds it down, as much as we live in this patriotic society, right? And so I think that it was these tools ingrained in me that I didn't either know about, have a like language to like understand and decipher, like, it was because of the powerful mujeres in my life, which all 3, if you think about it, my mom and both my grandmas are Scorpios, all of them. And so my interactions with each, like just the power and the strength, right? And I think of my cookies in Mexico, for example, comes from a very, like, they are a very traditional Mexican Catholic home with like 12 kids and married for, they were married for like over 50 years before my grandma passed. But my grandma would always be like, oh yeah, this is your tito's house and your tito makes the rules. But she was the person that handled everything, right? So like if someone needed to borrow money, my grandma would be like, oh, pregúntale a tu tito. But she administered everything. She would charge you fees. She would charge you interest. Like, she was like, let him feel like he's the king. This is my house. But if that's what he needs to have this feeling of like, I have this, control or what have you, right? She was like, that's fine. When she was the mastermind behind it all. Like, it was very like, wow, so much power and how you're navigating and moving. And I think that really influenced me in like my direction, right? So like going from the Bay Area to New York to go to school, which was like a very different world. I grew up really broke in the hood in the Bay Area. And so we did, like, I wasn't traveling like that. I wasn't like exposed to, all these different realities. And then even continuing on to my master's degree and then continuing on to a PhD, right? I don't think I would have had that power if it wasn't for like having these powerful mujeres around me all the time. So that was very influential. And I don't have kids. I got a dog, but I'm like the fairy godmother to a lot of my cousins' kids. So I'm really big on just make sure that I can be the best gender non-conforming individual in these kids' lives, right? Even having built conversations about like, yeah, Nino or Theo can have a boyfriend and that's okay. And these kids are like 4 or 5. And I'm like, if we don't like address this and have these candid conversations to normalize it, it's never going to be normalized. And so I also have a privilege in that, right? Because like I come home and like my family's very embracing now. Like I go home and it's like, a ver, mijo, and like they ask me about what I'm working on. I break down, well, this is what I'm doing, like hoteria and what it looks like in education and how we're deconstructing. Of course, in Spanish over food, right, at the table. That's how like we break this down. And so I love the fact that for me, I look at it as if I can sit at the table and I can break it down to like my dad, my tias and mom, etc., then that's the point. If I can't even have these conversations with like the people that I love the most, then like what the hell am I doing? Like, why am I in this space? Why am I trying to like preach and like, like why am I doing this research? Like, what the hell is my problem? For what? To have another title? It's a piece of paper. It ain't gonna do much, right? Like, it's just gonna sit there. It's what you're doing, how proactive you're being, how you like you're being critical of yourself, problematizing your thoughts while you problematize and work through the thoughts with these people, with my family, which I think it's the most beautiful thing. And the kids are at the table too, seeing that. So I think that's awesome because we didn't necessarily have that. Like I didn't have that growing up. And now I'm like, these kids have these awesome perspectives that they get to see when they engage with me, when they engage with other cousins that are queer, etc.
Oh, nice. So yeah, Anita, your take on this question?
I talked about my mom. She grew up in a very patriarchal home. Her father was, absolutely in charge, and my grandmother was in service to her husband, like all kinds of things. Like all the men would sit at the table first, and the women would serve them at every holiday, and just a lot of really strict patriarchal loyalty in my mom's family. And however, my mom was always the rebellious one. She's the biggest rebel in her family, right? And so it's again similar to my aunt, how she kind of was the one who broke the mold in terms of queerness. My mom broke the mold in terms of revolutionary, right? Because her family is like, ay, Delia, why can't you just do what we ask you to do? She's like, I'm not, that's not who I am. And so she's gotten a lot of rejection from her mother and her siblings, even though they love her and they're really close to her. They always kind of like shame her and make fun of her for being so rebellious. And still, she's like, she doesn't let anybody mess with her. And so growing up, she taught me, be who you are, mija. Don't let anybody stop you. Don't be ashamed of yourself. Love yourself, right? And I grew up with a hand difference. Like my hand is different than everybody. I only have 2 fingers on one hand. So that was like even bigger for me. Like it was really hard because I was embarrassed of my hand. People made fun of me. I was bullied. So even though I was queer, I was still bullied as a kid. And my mom was like my biggest champion. My father died when I was 8, and he was tried to be patriarchal, but I think my mom fought him back, and she did succumb to him for many years. But when he died, she was only 30. And so after that, she became even more fiercely feminist. Like, she was like, I'm not making tortillas for anybody. Don't ask for it. Like, the local grocery store sells it. So, like, I think she gave me a lot of strength. However, one of the things that she also taught me was not to trust love or relationships, because she was so burned by relationships and patriarchy. It was really hard for me to heal that, right? To trust that somebody could love me and could love me without hurting me. I didn't have any models for that kind of, an equal love, an equal, mutual autonomous love that was expensive and trusting, right? She was always like, te van a hacer pendeja, like stuff like that, because that's what she had been guarding herself from. So I got those messages from her. The message from my father, even before he died, was that he was also a badass, like he was smart, he was, loved, even though he was an abusive patriarch, right? And then what I had to do in my life as a parent was heal the stuff that they hurt, right? So my father, as an abusive person, I think he also had a mental illness that was never diagnosed. We've done a lot of reckoning with mental illness that exists in our family: depression, bipolar, schizoaffective disorder. My sister suffers a lot from her mental illness, but we all suffer from sadness, and spirit murder, and so we've had to heal a lot of that. And my message to my kids is: be your true self, be autonomous, be powerful, and heal yourself. Right? Like, get into your therapy, get into some healing, and work out those issues. So that's how I have tried to take all the lessons that I've learned and channel them as a parent.
Thank you, Nita. And I really appreciate the lesson of love, because I feel like that should be definitely more pushed in that, as well as with like respect, honesty, and such. So Sergio, how have you navigated like these emotions or these concepts in your livelihood?
Well, love definitely has been, I think, like what resonates with me, right? From my experiences, specifically like looking at the cultural messages, right, that I learned from like my parents, and I think about my mom, right? Like the power that my mom had, and like my mom is a 5'1", short little Mexican woman, first generation. But to this day, I'm scared. I will not say Nena, Maria, what have you. It's mom. I'm mom, because she's gonna hit me. Like there's that like respect. You respect her. She walks into a room and it's like you respect the space that she's in. You respect her, and she always had that. And for being such a small individual, it's like, damn, like that's hella powerful to be able to dominate a room, even with like a look. It wasn't even like I'm gonna overpower anybody. It's like I just walked in, and people know the kind of person that I am, so don't try it, right? So I think for me, like the power of the mujer, the power of the matriarchy, right? And stepping into your power. And I think I finally started to get it like recently. Because people are like, how are you so like hocicón? How are you so witty? And I get it from home. That's how we grew up. My mom was always like that. My mom was always very direct. It was never like, oh, mijo, are you okay? It was like, pues por pendejo, ¿pa qué hiciste eso? Like, now get up and like keep it moving, because nobody's got time to sit here and like, get caught up in these feelings, which is good and bad, right? Because it's like sometimes we need to process, because that's part of that healing. And I'm a Pisces, so I'm all about like, let's love and let's nurture. So people are always like, that's funny that that's your mom, because you can be the polar opposite. I'm like, I can be, but I know how to work. I know how that works, and I know how to turn those buttons on real quick and be like, who are you talking to? Who are you coming for? And like really stand in my own. So my mom really gave me agency, like that, and it has to do a lot with our cultural upbringing, right? I feel because it gives us like our sazon, if you will, because it's an added like bonus flavor thing to us. So no matter where we're at, it's like that gives you that extra oomph, having like this cultural like resonance and background and upbringing. And then with my dad, he definitely And I feel like I get it a lot more as opposed to when I was growing up. But my dad is very loyal. He's been burned so many times by like familia, you know, where it's like, oh, like the estafaron or whatever. And my dad is like the most loyal person. And as a kid, I hated it because I was like, F these people, like that you can't do that to somebody and then think it's okay. But my dad, loyalty, like his loyalty to us as family, loyalties, I think always superseded anything. So even when I came out, he was like very like, don't tell nobody, like I don't want to, like you're not, you know, you're not gay, this can't be true. But he never like kicked me out. He never let go of me. Like, and as we were talking earlier, right, like his loyalty to the fact that I'm his kid superseded anything else. So it's like I in essence did the worst thing this little man could ever think could happen to him, which was be a joto. Like that's the worst thing for this man. And yet he was like, he never like was let me go. He never denied that I was his kid. He was like, he was there, right? So I think that's very powerful. And then humility. And I think about it all the time. I'm like, and I say this like when I work with students, like in my work and, you know, other forums, I'm always like, I'm never going to be any better than the person who picks up the trash because my dad's a garbage truck driver, right? So I was like, I'll never be any better than the person who picks up the trash, which is my dad. I'll always be his kid. So like I may have 1,000 degrees, but I always tell him, you're never going to call me doctor. I'm always going to just be your hijo, and that's that. Like that's how it works in this house. So.
Nice, I really appreciate that. And so for Anita, what cultural messages have you learned from your mother and your father growing up? And also what cultural messages are you teaching to your child or children?
I identified myself as Tejana because I was born and raised in San Antonio, and my mom was born and raised in San Antonio. My grandmother was born and raised in Texas. Her grandmother was born. So we're like fourth generation Tejanas and Tejanos, Tejanexes. And so there's deep Tejanex identity, right? There's a love of, Tejano food. And we'll fight with people who say it's not real food because it's got yellow cheese instead of white cheese. I say, I think more than anything, the cultural, I relate the cultural aspects to our values, right? Like, which I've already talked about, like the value of a family, the value of authenticity, the value of not letting people, mess with you, like no chinguen conmigo, that's my mom's biggest thing. Like, what else? Like, I have a lot of little things that I say all the time that are so my mom that people laugh about. They're like, when they meet my mom, they're like, oh, I could see how you talk just like your mom. But I think I don't always look at those cultural messages. It's funny because Frida is all around me, but Frida is part of my racial consciousness, my gender and feminist and queer consciousness, more than my Tejanex upbringing. And I introduced Frida to my family because, as you know, if anybody who's grown up in San Antonio and in multi-generation Tejano community, there's a lot of internalized shame around being Mexican, right? There's a lot of pitting of Mexicans against Mexican Americans against Mexicans. And that was very much the case with me growing up. So I had to reclaim my Mexican identity. I had to reclaim my love of brown skin, right? Like we're the darkest, even though we're medium skinned, we're the darkest in our family. My dad was very dark brown. My mother is very light skinned. All of them are extremely poor, have, grew up in poverty. So really, it's a really interesting experience. And yet, that was those are all part of my cultural heritage, right? The reclaiming of our indigeneity, of our Mexicanidad, and this, really working hard to eliminate the internalized hatred that we were taught very actively in San Antonio, which I think is still a problem. If you go there, we're 70% at least. I haven't looked at the percentages lately, but we're 70% of the population, and there's still deep shame. So I would say, like, we're always proud of our food, our music, our clothing, like all of that is on high. But in terms of really claiming our Mexicanness, that has been a process that I've had to go through on my own and reintroduce to my family. And I'm really hard on my kids about like being obsessed with white social media, you know. And I'm like, there are no brown people in that, you know, in that show or in that, you know, TikTok. Like, who are the brown people you're following? Who are the people of color? You know, the music they like. My nephew likes metal. And my niece, they're my sister's children, and I've raised them, so they're both of our kids. My niece, she likes a variety of alternative music, but I'm always like, well, you gotta like at least one person of color. Like, don't come at me with these, you know, all white celebrities and not give me a more critical perspective of what you're engaging in on a daily basis. And then just being proud of who they are, you know, and being critical. That's for me more important than just cultural practice, is having a critical lens and understanding what race and racism is. We spend a lot of time talking about that.
Thank you. And Sergio?
I was gonna say, imagine growing up in Dr. Anita's house. That'd be a bomb-ass scholar at like the age of 5.
Girl, they hate it. My nephew's always like, "Hi, feminist."
Well, yeah. I mean, I think I answered a lot of that, right? And I just want to point something out that for me was really interesting, was that, so Anita's talking about that like that social construct in San Antonio, right? I didn't have that. Like, I grew up in the Bay Area. We were very proud. We were very like, this is who we are. Like, I'm Mexican, and this is who I am. This is the music. This is the people. But like, there was always that ingrained, like, you're proud of who you are, and that's who you are, right? So I never had to like, I never felt I had to reclaim my sense of being Mexicano. And I don't know if it was because of the strength of my mom, or it could have been, you know, an aspect of it. But I also think that, like, as I was mentioning right before we started, I grew up, so born and raised in the Bay Area, but when we were like 2, 3, 4, I remember spending sometimes up to 6 months in Jalisco, because my parents were like a hot mess. They were like, you know, living their life, drinking, drugs, and, you know, it was the 80s, so they were like popping off and doing their thing. And so I have a lot of like fond memories of like being in Mexico. Like, I spoke Spanish first, and I didn't speak English until I started kindergarten. And I didn't realize that because I guess I picked it up like so fast. They were like, you just picked it up. Next thing you know, you're speaking English, but you never spoke English, because my mom made it a point to not speak English to us when we were little, because my dad doesn't speak English well. So she was like, nobody speaks English to the kids, because I'm not gonna speak to them for example, in English, right? So yeah, so I was always really proud. So when I went to school in New York, I was like one of 4 Mexicans in the whole campus, which was really weird, because I went to like public high school a lot. It was like predominantly like Mexican and Latino. And while my college had a lot of Latinos and Latinx folks, I was a minority. I was like, what? And then meeting other folks that did identify as Mexican, and the shame that they had, I was in like a culture shock. So like, what do you mean you're ashamed? But then again, like, it was me learning to understand that, well, in my reality, in my lived experience, in my social construct, there was nothing wrong having power to being Mexican and accepting it. And so I don't know if my parents, I guess, continue, like, I don't know if my parents prepared me for adulthood. I feel like they did, right? Without saying like, oh, here's the manual, Sergio, like, this is what's going to look like when you know, get out there. But my mom was, I think because of like the critical tone my mom had, and like just how she was cutthroat and like never sugarcoated it, I wasn't surprised to experience what like I experienced in New York. Like, I wasn't surprised that like people are gonna like F you over. Like, si te pendejas es porque te pendejaste. Like, you willingly open that door to pendejarte if people screw you over. It's part of the learning experience, right? But at the same time, my mom always like, this is the real world. This is what it looks like. And then, you know, having to grow up in this dysfunctional, toxic environment too, of like, my parents were like drug addicts, and I had to like see that firsthand. And like, so that taught me, don't do drugs like that, because look at your parents, like, look at how your parents are reacting to the drugs, right? And then my mom going back and forth with relationships taught me to like, don't just trust anybody, because they're going to play you, right? And so like, you have to be careful. yeah, so I think prepared me to be like, go handle these things and be more, we say trucha, like ten trucha, like always look out, right? And I'm also a Pisces, so I feel like I was born and infused with this bruja vibe that has been like my spider sense. That's the best way I can explain it. And it just tells me like yes or no when I meet people. Like, and I've been like that since I was a child. So
I appreciate you for sharing. And so for Anita, yes, how have your parents prepared you for adulthood? And how are you preparing your child or children for adulthood?
My mom gave me the foundation and the strength to believe in myself. And that's probably the most important lesson that I've learned in adulthood, is that I have to believe in myself, that I have to be my real self. I think we perform a lot to try to prove ourselves, especially those of us who are in academia, but everywhere, right? We're always trying to prove that we're smart, that we're down, that we're deserving. And I really feel like my mom has been my biggest lesson for authenticity. And so I try to provide the same thing for my kids. And again, I'm going to reiterate that the biggest way that I'm preparing my kids is to try to teach them to be emotionally intelligent and spiritually sound. And as in spirit, I don't mean like religious in any way. I mean your spiritual essence, like who you are as a person, that your spirit be protected and taken care of. I don't allow them to do negative self-talk. I push them to challenge, the way that they're feeling when they're in the midst of hurt and pain, and to talk about it with us. We do a lot of communication. So like we sit every day since the quarantine for COVID-19, we've been sitting every day doing check-ins on a daily basis. How are you? What are your intentions? What do you want? How can you be supported? Those aren't things that I was offered, but I think my mom offered them in a different way, and I offered it in a more intentional way, right? So therapy and communication are my biggest modes of preparation for them.
So what advice would you like to share for those who are raising queer children and those who are queer?
Like, come from a place of love first. First of all, come from a place of love, just in anything that you do. And I guarantee you that you'll learn a lot more about yourself, about the world around you, and it'll give a lot more purpose and like more like want, I feel, as opposed to like, I'm just doing this because I'm doing this. Do it because it comes from a place of love, right? And so as much as we love like people, like as much as I love like my parents, as much as I love like my grandparents and like my family, I have to love myself. Like I'm first, right? And I think that's an everyday process. It's evolutionary too. Like it isn't just like, oh, I learned to love myself, check, and I'm good. No, like it's gonna hit in different ways and different modalities, and you just have to learn to be like, I love myself, and I'm going to. It's a constant practice because we're taught. I feel the system teaches us to not love ourselves with everything around us, right? Like what's beautiful, what's not, what's right, what's wrong. And so we have to like keep reminding ourselves, like you have to love yourself if you're going to do anything, right? Like that's going to give you more meaning, more passion, more like, sazon. So like love yourself as much as you're going to love somebody else, and, give yourself grace. Like I'm not perfect. Like my lived experience is my lived experience, right? Coming into my joteria and understanding the power in like being joto in academia, right? That is very white, that is very heteronormative, that is very like problematic in so many ways. Yeah, like love it, understand it, and like embrace that. Like I'm learning too, and like I'm learning from the people around me, from the people that I go to school with, from the people that have like continue to perpetuate this bullshit heteronormativity stuff. And I have to be open to like I need to learn. I need to like pick up these puzzle pieces and add them to the puzzle that is me and like the love that I give. And so when someone says no, find a yes, because I'm not here, and I didn't get here because it was like, hey, Sergio, we laid it out for you, undergrad, master's, and now it's at the PhD. It's been me having to find these other routes and having to find comunidad and having to find people like Doctora Anita and other folks that have been like super influential, impactful, and like loving to get me to where I'm at. And it's not even over. Like, I still have to like continue, like become a candidate, defend my dissertation, go look for a job in academia to become ultimately like this badass like scholar activist, to be like, fuck y'all, I'm gonna show you how it's gonna work type of thing. So I think it's an everyday process.
My words of advice to parents who are raising queer children is to be teachable. I think the biggest problem with parents is that they think they know better than their kids. And maybe on a lot of things they do, but on some things they don't, right? And so my advice to them is to let their children work towards their authenticity. And in doing that, you have to make a lot of space for them, right? And it's hard for me too, because, you know, my child will say, oh, I like this, or I think this is funny. And I'd be like, well, I don't really agree with that. Mostly I don't agree with stuff that's racist, classist, sexist, homophobic. But for the average heteronormative parent, they don't agree with queer kids. They don't agree with trans kids. And they're like, I just can't get okay with that. It's like, it doesn't matter if you get okay with that. That's who your child is, right? And I know that a lot of parents think they're protecting their children from, you know, when they try to stop them from being gay, but they end up being, and this is something that I think really can really resonate for people. A lot of people will tell me, well, I'm just trying to protect my child from hatred and discrimination. But what I'll tell that parent is, you're actually their first discriminator. You're the first person that's showing them hatred towards their sexual identity or their gender identity. So you have to eliminate your act of discrimination in your home, because your home is the most sanctuary place that your child should have. So if you truly want to protect your kid from discrimination, you won't be an active spirit murderer of your child's sexual identity or gender identity. So those are that's my advice to parents. And then for the young people, for the children, like be true to yourself. You know, be willing to challenge all of the social scripts that you've been given. Again, I like Sergio's message of rooting it in love. Also be open to learning and not, I think that's the other mistake when you're a young person, you think you know everything. And you do know a lot, but there's so much that we're learning the whole rest of our lives. So just be willing to like make space for all of the stuff that happens. Be willing to forgive yourself and others, and be willing to do the healing work that it takes to be a queer person in this world. Because if you don't focus on your healing, your pain can eat you alive and make you very, it can make it a very difficult life. So you just got to work on kind of protecting your spirit and restoring your spirit to the best of your ability.
With that said, that is all the time that we have. Thank you both for joining us. For everyone home, make sure you like the video, subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on all our social media outlets at LatinEntertainment_presents. Also, you can listen to us on our various podcast platforms that vary from Spotify, Apple Music, and Google Podcasts, just to name a few. Lastly, tune in next week as we discuss growing up and raising Afro Latinidad. As Latin Entertainment presents, Conversamos.